Hey, my name is Stone Cold Steve Austin. Welcome to the Broken Skull Sessions. My guest today goes way back at part of my wrestling history. He is a WWE Hall of Famer, a TNA Hall of Famer. His name is Jeff Jarrett. That's JEFFJARRETT. Hey, man, welcome to the show.
What? Hell has froze over.
What do you mean hell's frozen over? Why would hell freeze? You're sitting across the table from me.
It's kind of surreal. Stone Cold is spelling Double J's name. So I finally arrived.
Was this a conversation that you never thought would happen? Because over the past, for I don't know how many years, you're out of, when I started my wrestling career in Dallas, Texas, and shortly thereafter I would meet you, and we'd have a lot of matches together in my formative years. So I've known you almost as long as I've been in wrestling. But over the years, for some reason, the stories that go around on the internet and wrestle speak and all that stuff, there's perceived heat between myself and yourself. And I wanted to clear the air and take it off the table from the get-go.
It's cheers.
Cheers.
No.
But why do you think the rumor was that we're supposed to have?
And, I have been... Look, it goes without saying, whether it's on a podcast Yeah, folks, that was about 25 minutes before he went out and tore the house down. So I thought about, but you came over to me and we chatted briefly, and I'm like, F it, I'm going to get me a photo with Stone Cold before he goes out. But, we're going back all those years. And look, the essence of our business is people wanting to believe. That's obviously before Twitter and TikTok and everything going on. The internet has kind of just started, but people wanted to latch on, and different stories came out, and there was just real life but look, they latched onto the story, and it kept growing and kept growing. And I can't tell you how many interviews I've done and said, man, Stone Cold hates your stinking guts. Why? I'm like, now, hate my guts? That's pushing a little. Anyway, but yeah.
But we had dinner in Marina Del Rey years ago when I just started dating my wife.
Yep.
We'd had dinner. We've always conducted
That's on your
business.
podcast. That's what I tell folks. Steve was doing his podcast, I'll say non-WWE related.
Yeah.
And you called and said, hey, man, you'll do the podcast? And I'm just like, guys, he doesn't invite somebody on his own podcast to promote my stuff. That's what I was launching. I don't know what I was launching, but I was promoting something, and we chatted and all that. But it's funny how people want to believe what they want to believe. And I just went into it recently on my podcast. The first time I laid eyes on you, my dad said, hey, I want you to come see this kid. And so I'm 19 at the time, and I'm thinking, okay, kid. And then I see you in the ring. I was sitting up in the crow's nest at the Sportatorium, and y'all were doing some kind of Thursday night class or whatever. That's the first time that I laid eyes on you. And my dad's like, he loved you. And I was like, what'd you think? I go, Dad, he ain't a kid. Because in my mind, he said, I want you to come see this young kid that's in Chris's prize student. So anyway, that's the first time I actually saw you.
But I think a lot of people thought that the perceived heat stood from a payoff from your dad, who was the first promoter that I ever worked for. Because when I broke in the back end of '89, going into '90, y'all had just made a move and kind of were buying Fritz Von Erich, the Dallas territory out, and all of a sudden, it was my second tour in USWA. And your dad and myself had struck up a $100 a night guarantee. Now, a $100 a night guarantee is big money in the USWA back in the day.
Kidding, pal.
And we were in Evansville, Indiana. And this is where, in Evansville, everybody had their own cubicles.
I don't want to, this is your show, and I don't want to overshoot the runway. $100 a night in probably Memphis, Louisville, Evansville, Nashville. So maybe a spot show. So we're talking $400 or $500 for the week. I just wanted to clarify what this check's about. We'll go ahead.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm expecting to see a row of $100 bills, and I started seeing, there's a 60 here, there's a 50 here, and I'm like, hey, man, the agreement has been broken. Well, you walked in my dressing room.
I know the chair you were sitting at in Evansville, Indiana.
And you looked over my shoulder, and you just kind of slapped me on the back and goes, well, it ain't going to get any bigger by looking at it, boy. And in my head, I was heartbroken because it wasn't your fault. And this was the first time. You got to understand, I'm a couple of months in the business, and your dad is the first promoter I've ever worked with. So After Evansville, Indiana, we all drove home to Nashville, or some of the guys lived in Memphis. And the next night, we worked a spot show on Thursday. And as we were going to get on the bus, which your dad leased from Waylon Jennings back in the day.
I've never heard this story.
Oh, yeah.
I know the bus story. I've never heard this story.
Yeah, we're about to make the drive to Dallas. And as we're getting on the bus there at the Thursday spot show, could have been Lebanon, whatever it was, I remember going up to your dad. And again, your dad is not the biggest guy in the world, but he's the promoter. So he's the man, right?
Yeah.
And, your dad he always had that matter-of-fact personality about him. He's very knowledgeable about the business. And I remember I was nervous because I hated talking about money with anybody. I'd been a football player. I worked on a freight dock. And I went up to your dad. I said, "Hey, Jerry," I said, I got my paycheck last night in Evansville, and I noticed that I didn't make $100 a night. And he just matter-of-factly, his trademark would say, he goes, "You know what, Steve, the territory's down." He goes, "I understand if you got to leave, but that's just the way it is." And immediately I processed like, well, hell, he's going to let me go. And I looked at him, I said, well, no, I don't want to go home, Jerry, but maybe when the territory gets better, we can go back to the $100 a night guarantee. He goes, "That'd be fine, Steve." And I boarded the bus and went to Dallas, Texas, and kept working. But my dealings with your dad was always fair to me. But that's just the way it was. But I thought that story had, and we're going to move on with the show here because we want to talk about you. But it was an interesting come to Jesus meeting with Mr. Jerry Jarrett that night and talking about the $100 night guarantee. But I don't know if that was a story or when I was trying to be protective of my character later on when I would get to WWE. But as far as I'm concerned, there never has been any heat between you and me.
Yeah, no, certainly not personal, but it's funny how, and as you're telling that story, I'm reliving a couple of stories, but I guess we learn as we grow through life. But communication. Had my dad communicated and say, "Hey, Steve, when you open that check in Evansville, Indiana, which is the absolute worst town in the territory, and there's a couple hundred people out there, and it's a cold building, and young punk promoter's kid," and I believe me, I had said that line to multiple people, and I stole the line. Remember Frank Morrell?
Yeah.
Frank Morrell's the one who, it would be me, Frank, and a new kid in the territory, and on Wednesday, and we drove, and I took care of the gas or whatever it may be, but a kid would get in the check in Evansville, and Frank, sure enough, on the way home would say, "What'd you think about that check you got?" And most of the time the guy would go, "Oh my God, just all this." And Frank would go, "Well, if you keep looking at it, the numbers still ain't going to change. I advise you not to look at it again on this trip. Start drinking beer." So, no, but it's funny how the stories continue to build and build and build. And again, no personal heat, nothing.
And also, when a lot of times those checks were such low money, we would go to the liquor store and cash them because we needed money ASAP. And we would tell the guy running the liquor store that was our trans money, which was our gas and expenses to get to the towns. No, that wasn't trans money. That was our paycheck for a hard week work.
Now, Steve, you told me coming into this, doing this show, that I don't remember nothing. For you to remember that beer and liquor store right across from Evansville, Indiana, and Henderson, Kentucky, we'd pull right in there. And that's where the guys cash their checks. You remember that?
Well, I remember that. It's hard to remember, starving, paying dues.
Yeah.
But you know what? There was such a good crew of guys there. Like the USWA territory, I want to get into you, but the USWA territory was such a great place for a green guy to learn because you were working the same towns over and over and over in this endless loop. So you couldn't get stuck in a rut and just keep doing the same match. And you were working with veteran guys who would take you under the learning tree. And so that territory was paramount, and me really getting a fast track to learning how to work.
You go to Louisville on Tuesday and me and you are having a match, the exact same two guys, me and you got to follow the next Tuesday, so you can't have the same match. It's a great training ground. Didn't make no money, but...
When you was coming up as a kid, you're a third-generation wrestler. Eddie Marlin, who was always a part of the show, he helped run the shows. I didn't know that was your grandfather. Of course, Jerry, your father, was a wrestler and a promoter. And then you, and of course, your grandmother, Christine, used to work at box office, but she was also involved in Nick Goulas's territory.
Yeah. To me, it's still kind of fascinating. So in the 1940s, my grandfather, my grandmother, Christine Jarrett's husband, went off to war. He came home, but he didn't actually come back to his house. So she was a single mama too. raising kids. And in downtown Nashville, she walked by a shoe store, and there was a sign out front said wrestling tickets for sale, and the other sign said help wanted. And she walked in, and the owner of the shoe store said, "You want to buy wrestling tickets?" She goes, "No, I want to sell them." So she started selling wrestling tickets, and then she worked her way up to what we would call a CFO. She did the back end of the wrestling business, and my dad in high school promoted spot shows, armories and gyms and all that. And then he married my mom and went off to college and played football, then came home, and then he actually got into the business. So yeah, I'm third generation. And then my parents divorced, and my dad married Eddie Marlin's daughter. And so I've got a grandfather on one side and a grandmother on the other side of the family that were both in this business. And then my dad, and I'm one of 5 kids, but I'm the only one that stayed in it in this generation.
Being third generation guy, was it always written on the wall that Jeff Jarrett has got to get in the squared circle?
No, not at all. Like I said, I've got 4 siblings, and I'm the only one that loved it. I mean, I've got a passion for it more today than ever had. But back in those days, I was just fascinated by that physicality and being there. And I think one of the nights that really sucked me in, my dad and Tojo were wrestling the Blonde Bombers. Nightmare Danny Davis, I know you know him, but he managed them. But Larry Latham, who was Moondog Spotlight that I got to work with, and Wayne Ferris was the Honky Tonk Man. They beat the hell out of my dad, and I think I was in junior high, not smart to the business, still not really.
Your dad didn't smart you out?
No.
Okay.
Not smart to the business, but they get heat out in that old Fairgrounds arena, and they're hitting him with a riding crop, and it was real, and you can see the whelps, and I'm crying there's my dad getting beat up. But there was something about that summer that I watched, and the King was super over, that I just really fell in love with the component of having a wrestling match. Like stepping in there and like, I'm going to do this.
Was your dad ever resistant for you to follow in his footsteps? I mean, he knew what went on the road, and he was...
You know what? He never was. I played basketball, my high school. We were talking a little bit before we got going. I went to the basketball school, and then I transferred to the basketball school, quit playing football. So I was a basketball junkie and played all the time.
You had a game.
Played 1 year of college basketball, but during that summer, I had refereed. Before my college freshman year, I'd refereed in the summers and just loved that. And he knew I loved it. And as the college basketball year came to an end, he knew, and he said, "Hey, I want you to come to TV." And I'm like, "What do you got?" He said, "You got to referee." And I'm like, "Okay." Yeah, that's how I got started. We did the angle in March with Bill Dundee, Buddy Landell, Dutch Mantell, and Jerry Lawler. Lawler came back. But anyway, I was a referee, but my dad knew I loved it. He absolutely knew I loved it and wanted in.
So did you get any kind of instruction before you turned into a referee? Because there's a lot more to it than people think.
I probably watched more live wrestling. I just got the opportunity to watch a lot of it. But when I got in the ring and hear those veterans basically talk me through the match, not only were they leading their opponent, they were leading me.
Yeah.
And so I would come through the curtain and, "Hey, what did I do wrong?" And then, of course, my dad would, I got a lot of coaching.
What about formal training, just as far as learning how to throw? You always had that great drop kick. You're always up at this level. Just as far as the mechanics of the business, who taught you that?
Tony Falk, our old boy Tony. Tony Falk is the guy, my Fraser. Fantastic, but he had Shawn Michaels' first match. He had Cowboy James Storm, but Tony could take a young guy and have a basic match. But so we got out in my dad's barn. There was a ring set up, and we went through the kind of the basics. And so for about the first month or two, Steve, I was with Tony, a really controlled environment. But then just the luckiest thing, or by grace, that happened to me is